All right, what is going on, everyone? I am Tim Burzens, and this is Amplified Vitality. Welcome back to another video. I've got a lot of good stuff to cover in this one. I am really excited about this because it is something that I have been researching a ton this summer, something that I've been thinking a lot about, applying it to my own life and my life of my clients, and seeing the benefits and understanding how this one macronutrient that most people sleep on has so many powerful effects for different organ systems, for generating energy within the cells and keeping total metabolic rate high, decreasing stress, allowing the body to fall into a deeper sleep, and as the video title suggests, even helping with things like fat loss. And so I'm really excited to dive into this. I'm glad you're here. Let's get started. So the underrated, hidden, secret macronutrient, especially for fat loss, but in general, that most people aren't really thinking about or they underestimate it, is fiber. I consider fiber a macronutrient because it is consumed on the order of multiple grams, just like carbs and proteins and fats. And whether or not you consider alcohol a quote unquote nutrient, now alcohol could be considered a macro as well. And so fiber in this category is consumed in multiple grams, and therefore I consider it a macronutrient. However, most people don't really think of fiber as a nutrient because of the fact that it is not digested. So it's just kind of extra material that comes along with the food, and maybe it makes you feel a little more full because it doesn't have it dilutes the caloric density of different foods and bulks them up and makes them higher volume. But there's actually so much more going on with fiber, and especially with soluble fiber, as we're about to talk about, that we really don't want to be avoiding. There's so many good things that you can get from this, and we're going to dive into that today and have a good discussion about it. So when it comes to fiber, there are four ways you can kind of break it down. The first one is breaking it down between the categories of soluble and insoluble fiber. Soluble fiber absorbs into water, forms a gel-like structure. Insoluble fiber tends to, as the name suggests, does not absorb water. Between soluble and insoluble fiber, we can also break it down into fermentable and non-fermentable fibers. Fermentable being the ones that can be broken down by gut bacteria to produce metabolic byproducts that can be beneficial, that we're going to get into today. Non-fermentable obviously means that it has no effect on that. It does have indirect effects just because it can help to create some space between bacteria so they're not interacting so much, and sometimes it can carry fats and bile acids, which can also have certain effects as far as having an antimicrobial action, and that can supply a selective pressure on the microbiome. But largely insoluble fiber, it does kind of fall into that category of what most people think when they think fiber, which is just extra organic matter that's not digested and doesn't really do a whole ton. Again, that's not to say insoluble fiber doesn't have its uses, of course it does, but this video is going to be focusing much more on soluble fiber and specifically the fermentable soluble fibers. So we're going to go into this, we're going to dive into all the different types of fibers, all the different types of effects, and do a quick walkthrough to see how it affects each stage of digestion, but more importantly, how it affects each organ system involved through each step of this process, and how this actually helps with metabolism overall, helps with decreasing stress, and helps with metabolic parameters, and fat loss, sleep, and all the other good things that we're so excited about when we're looking to get amplified vitality. So let's dive in. The first thing I want to talk about as far as soluble fiber goes is its effect on delaying gastric emptying. So this alone, because it forms a gel and it causes your stomach to hold contents longer before it releases them into the small intestine and then moves them on through digestion, this effect alone does make you feel more full. It adds volume to the food. Because it absorbs that water, the stretching of the stomach alone helps with satiety hormones. And so it definitely does help decrease hunger and energy intake on that front. And so that alone, from a very basic physical standpoint, it can be very helpful for reducing food. But even more importantly is our carbohydrate tolerance, specifically when we're talking about gastric emptying. So the first part is that because it slows that gastric emptying, if you're having a high carb meal, this is going to slow the release of glucose into the bloodstream. Having a quick spike in glucose that comes back down is not necessarily a bad thing, especially if you have good glycemic control, because what tends to happen is the cells simply absorb all that glucose, store it away, or burn it, and then you come back down to a baseline where you might be burning more of a mix of fatty acids and glucose. Not necessarily a problem if your body's trained to be using glucose properly. But if you have some sort of problem that is preventing your cells from using glucose properly and you're not really responding to insulin and you're having poor glycemic control, slowing down this absorption of glucose into the bloodstream can be very helpful. Rather than overburdening the system and flooding it with this excess of nutrients that it doesn't know what to do with and is having a hard time processing and metabolizing, we can be a little more gentle with it, have a little bit of a slower increase in that glucose. There is this really cool idea that I have been working on as far as the height of a glucose peak. What you're obviously your body does not want blood glucose to get too high. If it does, dangerous things can happen. You get more glycation, more oxidation. There's a lot of inflammatory things that can happen from that. So, and again, short-term spikes not necessarily a problem if you can handle it well. But if you have all this excess glucose that the muscles and the liver aren't able to take up, then that's where the adipose tissue actually jumps in as a protective measure. It's trying to help you survive and says, bring in that glucose to me. I'm going to take it out of the bloodstream so that we can protect our organism so we don't get too high of glucose. So in this case, you're actually partitioning that glucose more towards fat when you're having this elevated excess glucose. This is also why people with diabetes and insulin resistance have a little bit of a harder time losing fat in general, because their glucose is always elevated. The fat cells are always trying to protect the bloodstream by taking in more, because the liver and the muscles aren't doing as good of a job of taking in that glucose and using it. So by slowing the gastric emptying, we're delaying the glucose absorption into the bloodstream, and this is allowing the muscle and the liver to be a little better at taking in that glucose. The amount of glucose percentage-wise, or relative amount of glucose that the liver and muscles can absorb, is likely improved because of the fact that the excess levels are not causing fat to take in that glucose. So that's number one. This can be very important. There's also some more glycemic stuff we're going to get to in a minute, but we're just talking about the gastric emptying for now. The second one is for fructose, for the fructose component of sucrose, of sugars, whether it's fruits or even just plain table sugar, honey, things like that. We've talked a lot about the sugar diet before and fruit fasting, and I like to do that intermittent fruit fasting. And part of the reason that I think fruit is superior in a lot of cases, and again, there's always people who have very specific contextual things that maybe the extra fiber isn't helpful. But in general, if you're using fruit, you're getting more of this soluble fiber. That slows the gastric emptying, helps to keep you satiated for longer. But when it comes to fructose, which has to be absorbed into the intestines and go into the liver, this is where we can have some extra benefits, because fructose is very rate limited in the amount that it can be absorbed, and also from the amount that the intestines can metabolize before that fructose or the end byproduct that it gets metabolized into before it reaches the liver, before that actually makes its way and comes into the liver. So there's all this fear around, the metabolic processes within the liver as far as fructose is concerned, because it follows a metabolic pathway that is unregulated, meaning that it doesn't have a negative feedback. If you pour a bunch of fructose directly into the liver, it will all just get metabolized right away. This creates a lot of substrates for fat synthesis, and people are worried about things like uric acid and stuff like that because some of the byproducts that get created. But the big thing that's missing from this conversation is the fact that most of the fructose that you eat below a certain threshold is actually metabolized by the intestines into other carbohydrate byproducts like malic acids, succinic acid, even lactate, and things like that that do not actually cause that metabolism of fructose in the liver like a lot of people are concerned about. This likely varies between people. It's probably not some stagnant number, but there is a threshold that when you pass it, then the fructose directly enters the liver, and then you can process it there. That's still not a big deal. Most of the research that shows negative effects are either using non-physiological doses or contexts like pure fructose by itself, which doesn't really exist in nature, or through infusion studies where they're actually directly injecting fructose into the bloodstream. Fructose is not normally in the bloodstream in high quantities at all, because it goes to the liver first before it is metabolized and released out, usually as glucose or lactate into the blood. And so these aren't really physiologically relevant. And then the other one is also a lot of this research is done in mice, and mice have a much poorer and less efficient fructose metabolism than humans do. So I think there's a lot of fear mongering and a lot of worry about fructose when it's not necessarily as problematic as a lot of people think. Again, there are contexts when it can be less beneficial, but largely it's not much of a problem. However, if you really want to make sure that you're getting the benefits from fructose and not overburdening the liver with too much all at once, the slow gastric emptying from soluble fiber does help to allow the intestines more time in order to metabolize and process that fructose before it even gets to the liver. This likely raises the threshold of the number of grams of fructose that you can ingest in one sitting before it even spills over. And because that metabolized fructose in the intestines doesn't actually produce direct glucose for the bloodstream, but rather those carbohydrate byproducts that end up going to the liver for being metabolized, this also allows you to get more carbohydrate in without having such a sharp rise in your blood glucose. It allows you to increase your total carb intake without spilling over into something that will raise your blood glucose levels, cause a higher insulin response, and all that stuff. So slowing down the gastric emptying keeps you more full, helps with slower glucose absorption into the blood, and helps your intestines metabolize fructose better so that you're not getting any fructose overload in the liver to begin with. So that's on that front. Now, the next level of this is the aspect about bile acids. So bile acids are produced by the liver from cholesterol, from LDL cholesterol. It's one of the byproducts. Cholesterol can turn mostly into either cell structures, steroid hormones, vitamin D, or bile acids. And so the liver produces bile acids. These help to emulsify fat during digestion because oil and water don't mix. Fat can't mix in with the digestive juices, so bile acid helps to emulsify and to digest those fats. Stored in the gallbladder releases that bile acid when the presence of fat is detected in the stomach. And the reason that soluble fiber is so important in this is that soluble fiber actually adsorbs that bile acid. So adsorb means that it connects on the outside. It doesn't actually absorb inside of the structure of the fiber, but it just attaches and sticks to the outside of it. So this is really important because normally when you eat fat, the bile acid will be released from the gallbladder, help to metabolize that fat, and then somewhere along the small intestine, that bile acid gets resorbed. So when it gets reabsorbed, it goes into the serum. We have bile acid in the bloodstream, and that can have some metabolic effects. There's a bunch of different types of bile acid, but bile acid can also kind of get, for lack of a better term, dirty. If it's recycled too often, if the liver's not working well. This is also partly where some gallstones and things like that can form because bile acid can become sticky and get calcium stones start to form within the gallbladder. This can cause a whole ton of problems. So soluble fiber, by binding that bile acid, prevents its reabsorption in the small intestine and actually excretes it. This has several effects. It means that your liver has to create new bile acid. That uses up cholesterol. This is why we see that your cholesterol levels typically drop when you start to eat more soluble fiber. That soluble fiber is removing the bile acid and creating a need for the liver to create new bile acid from that cholesterol, using up that substrate that gets produced. So this can be really helpful for metabolic health in general, and especially for heart health. This is why we see all the messaging about soluble fiber being important for cardiovascular health and all that stuff. But in addition to that, you're also cleaning up your bile acid. Because the bile acid is one of the ways that the liver helps to excrete toxins from the body, rather than reabsorbing that bile acid, which contains some of those toxins, we can actually allow it to be bound and taken out of the system. Because the liver is creating new bile acid, this makes the bile acid more effective and more potent because it is cleaner. It's kind of like a stagnant pond that grows mildew and algae on it versus a flowing river which never has anything grow because it just continues to move through. So that's what we want. We want this continuous movement through of the bile acid, new creation, expulsion of the old, and excretion of those toxins. And this is where soluble fiber can really shine. Additionally, bile acid also has a notable antimicrobial effect. Because it adsorbs, remember, it just attaches to the outside of the soluble fiber, this bile acid can have this antimicrobial effect throughout the system. We're about to talk about the microbiome, and we do want bacteria growing there, but by creating a selective pressure with a slight antimicrobial effect, we can help prevent the overgrowth of bacteria, especially up into the small intestine, and supply a selective stress to the microbiome that can allow more beneficial bacteria to thrive while keeping down the level of the bacteria that we don't necessarily want, the ones that can produce endotoxin and some of the other negative effects that we're trying to avoid. And finally, in addition to this, soluble fiber can also bind certain hormones and toxins like estrogen. Estrogen is released in the digestive tract as well, and by binding it and absorbing it, you can take it out of the system. One of the most powerful supplements for lowering estrogen is something called calcium D-glucarate. which helps to inhibit the enzyme beta-glucuronidase that causes reabsorption of estrogen and some other toxins in the small intestine. Fiber kind of acts in a similar way. It's less potent than calcium D-glucarate, but it does bind estrogen, prevents its reabsorption, just like the bile acids, and helps to excrete it. So soluble fiber is really good for getting rid of toxins and getting rid of hormones like estrogen that we might not want. And one last point is that soluble fiber can actually bind a certain amount of fat from the diet that we're eating. So if we're trying to keep fat lower in the diet, we can reduce the absorption by having more higher soluble foods. And so this is really important because it can indicate the types of carbohydrate sources that we might want to focus on. The ones that have more soluble fiber will have a better effect at helping to eliminate that fat absorption. And now we can move on to the microbiome, which is the most exciting part about all of this. So soluble and fermentable fibers, while not digested directly by the body, those fermentable fibers can be digested by the bacteria in the gut. There are some people who believe that the gut should be as sterile as possible. I don't think that pans out in the real world. If you're in a sterile environment, having a gut that has no bacteria might be okay, and you might have some better health benefits because maybe you're not exposed to some of the more negative bacteria or negative byproducts that could be produced if your diet is not good, if your intestines are struggling with that extra bacterial load. But in the real world, it's involved in immunity. Animals that have sterile guts tend to have worse immunity, tend to get sick a lot easier, and be more frail and more weak. We also know that there are so many benefits from the microbiome, and specifically from the metabolic byproducts that they produce. So specifically, as the metabolic byproducts from the bacteria in the microbiome, we're talking about the short-chain fatty acids, and that is acetate, butyrate, and propionate. The acetate's 2 carbons, butyrate's 3, propionate's 4, and they all have different effects, and they're all produced at different amounts based on the types of fibers that you're eating and based on the composition of your microbiome, both of which are important. A lot of people, have been using probiotics for the last few years. They are really popular. And the thing is, when you stop taking the probiotic, you stop getting the benefit because the bacteria is no longer continuously being resupplied through that supplement. I think the huge problem here is that the diet is not supportive of the proper bacteria in the gut to begin with. Having more prebiotics and having more of the specific types of fibers that you want will continue to feed the types of bacteria that you desire in the microbiome that are going to be producing this acetate, butyrate, and propionate that have so many good metabolic effects. Particularly, acetate is produced 60% of all the short-chain fatty acids produced in the gut. Propionate is next, and then finally the smallest amount is butyrate. But butyrate is the one that's been researched because it has so many amazing metabolic effects within the body. Butyrate is the primary fuel source for colonocytes, for the cells in the colon, and this helps to prevent leaky gut. It makes those tight junctions stronger because the cells have more energy, makes them more robust, and this allows them to have a greater barrier to decide what gets into the bloodstream and what doesn't. If you think about the entire purpose of the organism, the purpose of our skin, the purpose of having stuff on the inside and stuff on the outside, is because if we let just anything in, then our body would start to fall apart. We'd have no control. There would be chaos. This world is entropy, and we need to have order within our body in order to allow it to run properly and create all those higher coherent systems that work together. By supplying enough energy, we allow our body to have a stronger barrier function against the world so that we can decide what comes in and what doesn't. Particularly in this regard, we're looking at things like endotoxins because any endotoxins that are produced have to leak through the large intestine in order to get into the bloodstream. Once they do that, that's where the liver has so many problems. You get so much inflammation. You have the symptoms of like the flu. You get, the immune system activation. So many problems can be caused by endotoxin, and the best way to treat it is to treat leaky gut by causing those tight junctions to get stronger. The short-chain fatty acids, particularly butyrate, do an excellent job of this. They help to increase the gut mucus, which is also important for this. It creates the environment at which the intestinal cells can all work properly the way that they're supposed to. And because butyrate is absorbed and used by those colon cells, there's actually another benefit that comes from it that is particularly good for what we're talking about as far as fat loss is concerned. And that is that the gut is the major source of GLP-1. We know GLP-1 as the semaglutide, as Ozempic, as the popular weight loss drug that has 2 major effects: reducing your appetite and increasing your glucose tolerance and your glucose usage. This hormone is incredible. It does a lot of amazing things. While Ozempic takes you to super physiological doses that probably aren't healthy and have a lot of different side effects, naturally producing it in your gut will naturally have some of those benefits, but also within the context that it's supposed to be. Just injecting yourself with an exogenous hormone like that, you don't get all the other benefits. You don't have that context that supports it best. When you're naturally producing it and encouraging its production in the gut, then you do have all those things like having stronger tight junctions between your colon cells, having less inflammation, and so on and so forth. So to get this GLP-1, produce more butyrate from the soluble fiber in the microbiome, strengthen the tight junctions of the colon cells, and get a better GLP-1 production, which is going to improve your glucose tolerance and help to reduce your appetite. All good things when we're talking about fat loss. Now, 90% of butyrate is used by the colon cells, but there is a small amount that leaks out into the systemic circulation. I think this is probably the perfect amount. Some people have tried to argue that taking, a butyrate supplement, sodium butyrate or tributyrin, that these can be very beneficial for metabolic health. But I have not found that to be the case, mostly because you're not getting the major effect, which is occurring in the gut, in the microbiome, in the large intestine, strengthening those cells. So because you're not getting that effect, you will still get some of the benefits from the systemic butyrate, but it's not going to be the same as if it was produced in the gut itself. This is something that's an ongoing area of research, so there's going to be more data coming out about this soon, and I'm really excited to kind of dive into that and understand it better. But I think producing it in the gut and letting that little bit come out into systemic circulation is the best way to do it. There's even some evidence that it helps strengthen the blood-brain barrier. So that might, we know how the gut and the brain are very much tied in, mental function. Having stronger blood-brain barrier helps your brain to keep in what it wants and keep out what it doesn't want to let in. So all of this is super important for overall metabolic health. Now, propionate, the second most abundantly produced short-chain fatty acid, this gets absorbed into the liver more than anything else. And so it has specific effects on the liver. It's a really good substrate for gluconeogenesis, which helps to spare protein. So instead of using amino acids to produce new glucose, the liver can easily take propionate and turn that into glucose. It also has some effects on satiety and on appetite and on lipid metabolism. But what's really cool with propionate, similar to how I was saying people can supplement orally with butyrate, you can supplement orally with propionate. And the major effects they see are an increase in resting expenditure, an increase in fat oxidation, and a decrease in appetite. All good things that are on our side when we're trying to lose weight. Now, because propionate that's produced in the large intestine is absorbed via the portal vein and goes to the liver rather than feeding the colonocytes, oral supplementation, which follows the same path going to the portal vein and to the liver, likely mimics the effects of the propionate that's produced in the gut more than something like butyrate, since most of the butyrate is used by the intestinal cells. And so because of this, if we can produce more propionate, we're going to increase our energy expenditure, help with total body fat oxidation, and get those anti-inflammatory effects, those and helping with satiety and all that good stuff. And then finally, we have acetate, which is the one that's the most abundant. The 60% of the short-chain fatty acids are produced. Acetate doesn't have a ton of metabolic effects. It is kind of anti-inflammatory, but mostly it's a fuel substrate for the cells throughout the entire body. It's not specific to the liver. All cells in the body will be exposed to the acetate. But there is something really important here, and that is the fact that because meals don't really reach the colon until about 6 to 8 hours after you're eating, and because the bacteria that's fermenting those fiber are producing substrates like acetate, which can be used as energy within the body, you are supplying energy to all the cells in a very easy to use way on a longer timeline. Instead of having dips where you kind of slip back into a fasting state where your body has to activate the stress hormones, you're still providing fuel even between meals. If you're having 3 or 4 meals a day, you're not going more than 6 to 8 hours between eating. And so you're getting these short chain fatty acids that are fueling the cells of your body and helping to increase your metabolism between meals, while you're also getting the increase in glucose and amino acids that come from the actual meal itself. And so it kind of blends things a little bit more and kind of keeps your body in a more resilient and stable place, because it's not this constant up and down in nutrient availability. Now we have the nutrients available on a more broad timeline because the gut slowly is turning that into really powerful substrates for energy metabolism. And then finally, a couple other notes about the microbiome. The Acetate will help to increase the gut acidity, which is really good for keeping pathogen growth down. The higher fiber intake also increases the colonic absorption of things like calcium and magnesium, so our mineral balance gets a lot better. It also helps with hydration just because of the fact that soluble fiber is holding onto that water, and so it allows the colon to absorb water if it needs to. And so hydration, minerals, gut acidity, all these things are also tied into this as well. So as you can see from all this, when we're focused on something like fat loss, we want something that's going to help us use glucose better so that we're not having elevated glucose for a super long time, causing the adipose tissue to take in that glucose to protect our bloodstream from getting too high. We want something that's going to decrease our appetite so that we're naturally, behaviorally, psychologically less hungry. We don't feel the need to overeat. If you can naturally reduce your food intake while using the fuel that you are eating better, this is a better way for your body to tap into its fat stores and to be able to lose that fat more easily. Decreasing stress, which of course, if you're stressed, your body isn't going to want to release that fat. It's trying to hold on to it as a protective measure. The fact that we can be reducing stress through this is huge. And the fact that we can be specifically supplying the organs that we want to protect while still eating less calories overall allows us to maintain our health while we cut back on the amount of energy that we're consuming. And this is so important because if you think about what happens when you start to cut calories to try to lose fat, is the organs will start to work at slower rates and not be as efficient at doing their jobs. This is not what we want for health because our health depends on the function of these organ systems. If our liver isn't working quite as strong, if our gut's a little bit weaker, if our lungs aren't able to breathe as much, we're not going to be burning as many calories and our health is just going to be suffering. If we can maintain the function of these organ systems while still being in a calorie deficit to allow fat loss to occur, this is the healthy and sustainable way to hold on to that leaner body and to release that fat without having as many of the negative side effects. So this is why soluble fiber is so amazing. And like I said, in testing this myself, I've noticed so many amazing things. My sleep has gotten better. Fat loss is easier. Appetite is down. Energy is more stable. Body temperature is up, all that kind of really good stuff. And so this is where soluble fiber can be such an important aspect to add to the body. It actually has a biochemical reaction. It's not just extra organic material that's adding bulk to your food. It is a nutrient that is specifically acting on the microbiome to have these metabolic effects and create these short-chain fatty acids and metabolic byproducts that do alter our hormones and create a different environment in which our bodies are operating. Now, I know this video is getting a little bit long, but I do want to cover really quickly the different types of fibers and the food sources that you can get them from and which ones are the best for producing different effects within the body. All of the soluble fibers pretty much have that bulking quality where they absorb water, turn into a gel, and slow gastric emptying. So that's pretty much true for all of them. As far as binding bile acid, it seems like beta-glucans from oats and barley are the best. These have the strongest effect on improving glycemic control and lowering cholesterol levels. And this implies that there is something going on with the bile acid because the cholesterol level improvement is involved in that system. Having said that, all of the soluble fibers to different extents will still bind bile acid and will still improve cholesterol levels. And so either way that you look at it, you're still getting the benefit from it. But as far as the microbiome goes, if we're trying to produce more butyrate, which I think is the number one thing that we should be focusing on as far as the short chain fatty acid production, the top contender of all that produces the most butyrate is a type of fiber called inulin. Inulin is from Jerusalem artichokes, from chicory root. There's a couple other sources as well. You could take it as a supplement. This one is amazing for feeding and selectively feeding the really good bacteria, the bifidobacterium and lactobacillus bacterium, that have such good effects that can produce the butyrate for us and help to keep our colon nice and strong and our gut integrity really, really strong and resilient. Rivaling inulin is the beta-glucans, like I just said, with the cholesterol and glycemic control. Beta-glucans found in oats and barley, these are really great as well. They can also produce a lot of butyrate. Maybe not as much as inulin, but I still think that they are a top tier fiber that we should be focusing on. If inulin and beta-glucans were the two fibers that you really focused on, you're going to get the most benefit out of this. Right below that, we have resistant starches. Resistant starches aren't technically fiber. They're just modified starches that can't be digested. They do have a good effect on producing butyrate and propionate, but they are probably less than beta-glucans and inulins. And then below that, we have pectin. So pectin is the primary soluble fiber that we find in pretty much all the foods that we consider as soluble fiber foods. Fruits are high in pectin, beans are high in pectin, sweet potatoes are high in pectin. all these foods, the major soluble fiber that they have is pectin. Pectin does ferment and does produce some of these short chain fatty acids, but not nearly the amount and not nearly the full fermentation that you get from something like inulin or the beta glucans, and to an extent resistant starch. And that's why while it's good to have more soluble fiber just from the foods, this alone might not necessarily be the path that is going to have the most impact on your metabolism and on your digestion. Whereas something like beta glucans, if you're eating more oats or you're eating more barley, this can have a very positive effect. Or if you're supplementing with something like inulin, I don't know if anyone eats chicory root or Jerusalem artichoke normally, but if you do, you're getting some of that inulin from that as well. Inulin is found in small amounts in other foods, but I find the best is to just supplement with it. And then finally, this one ties into one of the caveats that I have is psyllium husk. And I mentioned this in my previous video on SIBO. Psyllium husk is the least fermentable, so therefore it produces the least amount of those short chain fatty acids. However, it is still really good for binding bile acid, for lowering cholesterol levels and improving glycemic control. It also adds a lot of bulk to stool and really helps to improve the gut motility and move food through the system. So psyllium husk is really good for that, but because it's less fermentable, it is actually a better choice for someone who is dealing with SIBO. Now, if you are someone who is dealing with SIBO, avoiding these fermentable fibers for the short term can be beneficial because you're not feeding the bacteria that have grown up into the small intestine. However, this isn't something that you want to do forever. The best way to heal from this would be to reduce the bacteria in the small intestine, improve the acidity of the digestive tract, and improve the breakdown of nutrients in the stomach before you even get into the small intestine. If you're doing this, then you can get to a place where the digestive tract is working better and more strongly, and then you can add in the fiber to get those benefits from the microbiome. But in the short term, cutting it out or sticking to psyllium husk, especially pairing it with coconut oil, since coconut oil has an antimicrobial effect, this can be really powerful and important. So I think that covers it all. This is a lot of information in this video. I know it was a little bit of a longer one, but this is something I've been thinking about a lot this summer, really focusing on trying to understand it. And again, I slept on this for too long. I was just assuming fiber was bulking agent in food. It was just organic material that you couldn't digest, but it wasn't really having any direct biochemical effect in the body. And that is completely untrue. The fermentable soluble fibers help to increase GLP-1, improve glycemic control, keeping your blood sugar lower, help to improve cholesterol levels, and reduce inflammation, improve gut barrier function, brain barrier function. Like I said, in the practical sense, sleep is better, energy is better, body heat is better, hydration, mineral status is better, fat loss is easier, appetite is better. All these things just from adding in more soluble fiber, specifically by eating more things like oats and supplementing with inulin fiber. So if this is something you want to try out, I highly recommend it. The one caveat that I think is really important is to go slow when adding soluble fiber. If you add too much, you will get gastric disturbances. I would start with something small like an extra 3 grams twice a day, maybe slowly move that up to 5 grams twice a day. But eventually you can move that up to the place where you're getting a total of somewhere around 30 grams of soluble fiber a day. And when you're doing that, you're going to notice that the gut is working a lot better. The microbiome is a lot stronger. That's when you're going to start noticing all of the glycemic effects and the higher body temperature, the better sleep. And this is something that I definitely recommend everyone start to try to play with. So I think that's all I have for today. Thanks for listening. I hope that you guys enjoyed this one. Please leave comments below and we'll continue the discussion there. Give me a like if you enjoyed this video and please subscribe for more content. I'll be back with another video very soon and I hope to see you guys then. Peace.